Your Texas Longhorns are the best team in the country. That's not a question. That's a definitive statement.
You are Locked On Longhorns, your daily podcast on the Texas Longhorns. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Longhorns, the show. Jonathan Davis, your host. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/Locked On today to get started. And on today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, we are discussing the dominant victory by Texas over the Kansas Jayhawks in DKR this weekend. And I tell you why I think through 5 weeks, Texas is the best team in the country. You know how we do it on Monday, the last segment, the Big 12 Roundup, everything you need to know about your least favorite conference outside of what happened on Saturday between Texas and Kansas. All of that and more on today's episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So we're talking about Texas, and when I look at them, I kind of took the wait and see approach after yesterday coming into the season, guns ablazing, saying we're going to be this good and we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And then after the loss to, Alabama and Texas Tech, kind of changed the football season last year. But I thought they responded well, in year two of somewhat of a rebuild and went 8-5. And we had a lot of really good expectations and good feelings about this team coming into this year. I want to take it back to 2021, right? Because it felt like it didn't feel like we were in a really low point for the program, going 5-7 in the first year under Steve Sarkisian. He had to, fix the culture and kind of fix the roster, but Texas should never go 5-7 with the amount of talent that they bring in. And remember how you felt, or take yourself back to how you felt that day when we lost to Kansas, right? I think that probably has been maybe the lowest point in the last 10 years in this program or close to it. But take yourself back to how you felt that day, how you felt about this Texas football program, the direction they were headed in, about Steve Sarkisian, et cetera, right? Since that point, this team is winning 70% of their games. And in the two games against Kansas, since that debacle in Austin, right, they have outscored the Kansas Jayhawks 95-28, beating them 55-14 in Lawrence last year, and then, of course, beating them 40-14 on Saturday. So, Steve Sarkisian talked about how that Kansas game was a turning point for this program. And like I said, based on the statistics, I would say it was, because they've won 70% of their games since then. You would expect the University of Texas to win 70% of their games on a year in and year out basis. And they've outscored Kansas, like I said, 95-28 since falling to them in DKR in embarrassing fashion 2 years ago. When I look at this game on Saturday, I thought it was a special performance on both sides of the ball, right? When you hold the ball for 40 minutes, only allow 14 points, have over 600 yards of offense, right? That's just a dominant performance. And I think when you look at Texas so far through 5 weeks, they've done a really good job of establishing themselves, I think, as the best team in the country, right? Because there is no team at the top of the rankings that has been challenged the way that Texas has, and there is no team in the country that has responded to their challenges the way that Texas has. You could say maybe LSU has the toughest schedule, right? Having to play a Florida State team and an Ole Miss team in the first 5 weeks, but they lost both of those games. They're 3-2, right? And then you look at a Florida State at the top of the schedule, you could say, okay, they played LSU and Clemson, but Clemson almost won that game, and they almost lost to Boston College, right? There is not a team as complete as Texas in the country right now. There's not a team that has rose to the occasion as much as Texas has thus far. And there is not a team that has responded to the challenges on their schedule as well as the Texas football team has thus far. And it showed on Saturday with the dominant performance. I want to talk about Jonathan Brooks. He has to have inserted himself in the Heisman conversation at this point, right? I know that Quinn Ewers is probably the top Heisman candidate on the team. He's done really well at the quarterback position. That's a glamour position. You're looking at players like Shadur Sanders, Michael Penix Jr., of course, Caleb Williams with a dominant performance on Saturday that are obviously leading the Heisman race. But if Texas is the best team in the country, which I don't think is debatable right now, even though they're only ranked number 3 or number 4 in the AP poll, can't remember which one it is, Jonathan Brooks, I think, has been the best player on this football team, at least on the offensive side of the ball, for 5 weeks. This week against Kansas, 241 total yards and 2 touchdowns. And remember, for whatever reason, he wasn't the starter coming into the season, right? It took, unfortunately, a Cedric Baxter injury for us to put, Jonathan Brooks in there, and rightfully so. We saw, the previous 2 years when he was spelling Bijan Robinson and Roschon Johnson, he looked like one of the most electric players in the country. And we felt like coming in this year, even though we were losing Bijan Robinson, we would still have a really good run game, right? Jonathan Brooks is not the player that Bijan Robinson is, but he's been as productive, maybe even more productive than Bijan Robinson was last year through the first 5 games. So you're still getting that type of elite production from the running back position. And if we're talking about a player that week in and week out is controlling the game for this Texas football team, and they are the best team in the country, then Jonathan Brooks certainly has to be in the Heisman conversation, along with all those great quarterbacks I just mentioned. And if Texas can keep this up, keep winning game in and game out, and, stay undefeated, or, have maybe a close loss somewhere in the season, but still, establish themselves as one of the best teams in the country, then I think you can see a scenario like we did in 2020 under Steve Sarkisian, where Najee Harris and Mac Jones were sitting up there, or were one of the top Heisman candidates, I should say, 2 of the top 5 Heisman candidates. You could definitely see that this year if Texas takes care of business with Jonathan Brooks and Quinn Ewers, the way that Jonathan Brooks is playing. On the season, 684 scrimmage yards and 6 touchdowns. He is averaging 7.5 yards every time he touches the ball on 91 touches. This is not on 25 touches. This is on 91 touches, 7.5 yards every time he touches the ball. It's time we start talking about Jonathan Brooks as a legitimate Heisman contender for this Texas football team, which currently is the best in the country. I want to talk about Quinn Ewers, right? And I always make a point to talk about Quinn Ewers because of the expectations he had coming into the season, right? One of the highest graded quarterbacks of all time, one of the highest graded recruits of all time. We brought him in because we felt like Casey Thompson and Hudson Card weren't good enough to get this Texas football team where they wanted to go, right? We thought Quinn Ewers was a step up from those quarterbacks. And based on what we've seen the last 2 weeks and some of the biggest moments, he has proved that, right? I was hard on Quinn when it felt like he wasn't living up to his potential. He was leaving plays on the field, et cetera, et cetera. I think now this is the first time he has put 2 back-to-back elite performances on tape. You could say last year, Alabama, but then he got hurt, and then Oklahoma. I just don't consider those back-to-back games, right? But the way that he responded to the Wyoming game, playing at Baylor, damn near being flawless in that game, and then coming back, even though he threw an interception in the first half, completed over 70% of his passes, 365 total yards, and 3 touchdowns. And I love the way that when it's not there, he's not forcing it. He is taking off and running. And after losing those 20 pounds, the broadcast talks about it every week. He has become a dynamic runner for this Texas football team and really added an extra layer, something else for defenses to defend against this Texas offense as if they didn't already have enough to worry about. So Quinn Ewers is playing like a Heisman level quarterback right now. Quinn Ewers is playing like the number 1 overall recruit in the 2021 class. And like I said, I think this is the first time at the University of Texas he's put 2 elite performances back to back on tape. And if he can continue to do this against Oklahoma, then he will find himself on that stage in New York at the end of the season in competition for a Heisman Trophy. Quinn Ewers is starting to look like that player he was at South Lake Carroll, dominating under Steve Sarkisian at the college level. Coming into the season, we talked about A.D. Mitchell and Xavier Worthy, and especially with Xavier Worthy coming off a down year, we said that these could be, wide receiver 1A and 1B, right? And that certainly was the case on Saturday for the first time. I'm not going to call him Adonai, right? I know he prefers to be called Adonai now, so I'm not going to say AD anymore. Adonai Mitchell, 10 catches for 141 yards and a touchdown. He was dominant. And then Xavier Worthy, even dealing with all the double teams and brackets he was dealing with, had 7 catches for 93 yards. When you look at it, talk about wide receiver 1A and 1B, right? 68% of Quinn's completions went to Adonai and Mitchell and Xavier Worthy. 72% of Quinn's yards went to Adonai Mitchell and Xavier Worthy. And then Quinn's only passing touchdown went to Adonai Mitchell. So Quinn Ewers did a really good job of spreading the ball around. I think he threw the ball to 8 different receivers, had completions to 8 different receivers. But on Saturday against Kansas, it was the Adonai and Xavier Worthy show. They were dominant, combining for over 200 yards and pretty much 3/4 of Quinn Ewers' production on Saturday. And I just want to give a quick shout out to the offensive line, right? They started off a little shaky against Rice. Maybe we're a little shaky at times, against Alabama. But I think the last 3 weeks against Wyoming, Baylor, and Kansas, they really stepped up to the occasion, right? The offensive line has to be really good if you're getting 661 total yards on the offensive side of the ball. The offensive line has to be really good. And this offense as a whole, if you're 11 for 17 on money downs, that's 3rd and 4th down. That was an issue last year, has not been an issue thus far for the Texas Longhorns this season. And I talk about time of possession a lot, or I used to. This Texas team has kind of proved me wrong because they're able to go out and dominate teams while other teams are winning time of possession. Case in example, last week, Baylor had the ball, I think 35, almost 40 minutes, and we beat them by 30 points. But this was a true dominant performance where Texas not only beat up on a team on the scoreboard, but held the ball for almost 40 minutes and really just controlled the game in DKR. Kansas never stood a chance. So I really loved what I saw from the offensive side of the ball. But I want to give, a huge shout out to Jonathan Brooks. Like I said, he should be in the Heisman conversation. Give a huge shout out to Quinn Ewers. He talked about his religion this week, his spirituality, and he's really starting to play free and play like that player we saw at South Lake Carroll. And for the first time, Adonai Mitchell and Xavier Worthy had a dominant game at the same time in the same game, showing that they both are wide receiver ones for Quinn Ewers. So the dominant offensive performance, like I said, Kansas stood no chance. They came out from, the opening drive and showed that they meant business. A quick word from our sponsors, and then we'll talk about Jalen Daniels missing the game and how the defense rose to the occasion in the second segment. This episode of Locked On Longhorns is brought to you by Athletic Brewing. Athletic Brewing Company has completely changed the non-alcoholic beer game. They make non-alcoholic beers that actually taste good, full flavor and well-crafted, just like a full-strength beer. Their brews are great tasting and award-winning and beat out full-strength beers in global competition. Over 50 styles of craft non-alcoholic beers, including IPAs, golden sours, and more, constantly releasing limited edition experimental styles to add to their variety. You can find Athletic Brewing Company's non-alcoholic brews at a store near you or buy online at athleticbrewing.com. First-time customers can use code LOCKEDON to get 15% off your first online order. That's code LOCKEDON at checkout for 15% off at athleticbrewing.com. Near beer, exclusions and conditions apply. Athletic Brewing Company, fit for all times. All right, we're talking about this Texas defense now, and I have to beat my chest just one more time, pat myself on the back one more time. I said that coming into the season, if we could get 10 games out of Jalen Catalon, that was the qualifier, right? I said if we can get 10 games out of Jalen Catalon, this Texas defense would be borderline elite, right? Or could be elite, right? And even though, Jalen Catalon has been somewhat on a pitch count, I know Steve Sarkisian says he's not on a pitch count. He's on a pitch count, right? But even if it's not called a pitch count, whatever it is, right? He's not playing as many snaps as we thought he was. It hasn't mattered. This Texas defense is certainly elite, has not allowed 25 points this season yet. I don't think they've allowed 3 touchdowns in a game. If they have, that's the ceiling. That's the most they've allowed. They've just been a spectacular unit all season. And when you look at the Jalen Daniels situation, I think it's tough, right? You're going into a tough game in the Cotton Bowl next week against Oklahoma, and you certainly want to face every team at full strength, right? And Jalen Daniels was looking like a really good quarterback up until this point. He had missed week 1 with some back tightness, and I think, that's what kind of happened this week. The back is tricky. It kind of controls, almost everything that you do, especially at the quarterback position, or it's affected by everything you do, I should say, at the quarterback position. And, if your back is tight, you're just not right? And he came out or they said he didn't warm up at all, didn't come out with the team at all. He was just in the locker room, and they said they had no indication that his back was even an issue at all until they got to Austin. And they said he was warming up in his hotel room. Something happened. He was unable to play. So, I think that you always want to face teams at full strength. You always want to gauge how good this Texas football team is, against some of the top competition and the top players in the nation. It wouldn't have mattered. This Texas team would have beat up on Kansas, whether Jalen Daniels or Jason Bean was playing. But I think going into a tough game next week against Oklahoma, you would have liked to see how this defense would have handled a dual threat quarterback, a true dual threat quarterback, and Jalen Daniels. So I'm praying for a quick recovery for him. But I think that, you have to play who's in front of you. You have to play who lines up. And the Texas defense did a really good job of that against Jason Bean in this Kansas offense. Kansas was 0 for 10 on the money downs. I talked about Texas being 11 for 17 on the money downs. That's 3rd and 4th downs. That's where you want to win the game, right? Kansas 0 for 10 on 3rd and 4th downs. This Texas defense, who could not get off the field last year at times on 3rd and 4th down, especially against Texas Tech and Oklahoma State, did a really good job against this Kansas offense. 0 for 10 on 3rd and 4th downs, which is crazy. Kansas only completed 42% of their passes. Now, you would expect if Jalen Daniels was in the game, their passing offense would be a little bit more prolific. But I'm going to give credit to this Texas defense, right? I'm not going to sit here and say, well, Jalen Daniels didn't play, so this doesn't matter. Jalen Daniels didn't play, so this doesn't matter. You have to control what you can control. You have to go out there and play who suits up, right? And Kansas was only able to complete 42% of their passes because this is a, great defense with a hellacious pass rush that, caused trouble for them all day and has caused trouble for every opponent they've had in the first 5 weeks. You look at that first touchdown they scored, that fluke fumble touchdown where I think Devin Neal fumbles it and Highsmith takes it into the end zone. That was a 45-yard touchdown run collectively, right? Outside of that, they ran it 23 times for 79 yards, the remainder of the game. So that's a little bit over 3 yards per carry. So you're talking about a defense that's not only stuffing people in the run game or dominating with their run defense, but also dominating in the pass. They're just really putting complete performances week in and week out on tape and, not really giving offensive coordinators much room to do anything, right? Even when they came out with that option and it looked like, oh, okay, they're making plays, in the option early on. This is something that could give the Texas defense trouble. They, buckled down on that. It started to stop that, right? So there's just really no weakness on this Texas defense right now. And there's no area that offensive coordinators can come in. Now, this may change against Oklahoma, right? Let me knock on wood. I don't want to speak too soon. But there's really no area on this Texas football team or this defense right now that I feel like offensive coordinators or quarterbacks can come in and say, we're going to attack him or we're going to attack that area of the defense or this defense struggles with that, right? If it's happened through 5 weeks, I haven't seen it. So this Texas defense is causing a lot of trouble for opposing offenses, and that continued on Saturday against Kansas. When you look at it, we talked about the depth on this Texas football team, right? The coaching of Pikakowski and his staff, the depth, the development, all of that. And it just shows up at a high level on tape. Each week, it seems like 18 to 20 players are not only getting on the field in terms of spells and rotations, but they're actually making plays. 22 different defensive players recorded a stat for Texas on Saturday. Only 11 started at a time. 22 different defensive players recorded a stat. That might be my favorite thing about this Texas defense, might be my favorite thing about this Texas football team as a whole, is that when you take those starters out and you put the second team in, there's no drop-off. And when you take the second team out and you put those true freshmen in, there's no drop-off, right? When the true freshmen are playing with the ones, there's no drop-off. When the true freshmen are playing with the twos, there's no drop-off. When you have 11 players on the field on defense with the Texas jersey, regardless of what the name says on the back, there's no drop-off. All the credit in the world to Pikakowski, his staff, the development of these players, and these players for buying in, right? We saw how they looked in the first year in this system. It didn't look great. We saw how they looked in the second year in this system. It looked good for the most part, but there were times where they left a lot to be desired. Now, the third year in the system under Pikakowski, this looks like an elite defense, one of the best defenses in the country. So the players trusted the process, the coaching staff trusted the process, and now it's showing up at a high level on tape on the field. And then you talk about individually, right? I said Jonathan Brooks may have been the best player on the team through the first 5 weeks. I had to qualify that and say offensively, because when you look at what T'Vondre Sweat has done, according to Pro Football Focus, and you have to kind of take everything you hear from them or see from them with a grain of salt. But, if they're pumping, sunshine for the Texas players, I'll take it with a little bit more of a grain of salt. T'Vondre Sweat, the highest graded defensive tackle in the country right now with a grade over 91 through 5 weeks. That is extremely hard to do. But because of the depth that you have on the defensive line, because of the depth that you have on this defense, you can have T'Vondre Sweat playing high-level snaps, right? You don't have to put him out there or overexert him or make him play a bunch of snaps, and now he's giving, half effort or he's tired or he's huffing and puffing. You can put T'Vondre Sweat out there when he's fresh and ready to cause havoc, and when he's not, you can bring in players behind him that will give you that same level of effort and production in small sample sizes. So this defense has just been amazing. T'Vondre Sweat and that defensive line have really carried this team through 5 weeks, we have Jalen Ford, an All-American at linebacker, but every player on this defense has stepped up to the plate and risen to the occasion so far this season. And that's how you end up with 2 back-to-back dominant performances in conference play, winning 38-6 against Baylor and then 40-14 against Kansas. It looks like we're heading out the conference on a high note, but as we know, we got a huge week coming up this Saturday. Texas, Oklahoma, Cotton Bowl, Red River, 11 a.m., College Game Day, ABC, all in that and more. It's going to be a special. So we talked about Texas beating up on Kansas 40-14. Now I got to give you the rundown on what happened in the rest of your least favorite conference, the Big 12 roundup, after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode of Locked On Longhorns is brought to you by FanDuel. Snap into action this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. The app is so easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options, including spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel, the official partner of the National Football League. I believe Texas starting off is either a 5.5 point favorite over the Oklahoma Sooners ahead of the Red River Shootout. We will see what that line looks like ahead of kickoff on Saturday. All right, time for the Big 12 roundup. What's going on in your least favorite conference outside of the Texas Longhorns? We're going to start with Cincinnati and BYU. Cincinnati started off the season 2-0, since have lost 3 in a row. Emory Jones is their quarterback. Remember, he was at Florida before Anthony Richardson. I'm just not sure he's good enough to win games at a high level in the Power 5, and it's showing, since Cincinnati has picked up their competition on their schedule. BYU, got back on track. I think they lost last week after starting off 3-0, but now they're 4-1, looking like one of the better teams in the conference, even though the Big 12 is certainly down this year outside of Texas and Oklahoma. And, I think we have a bye and then play Houston after Oklahoma. So we'll face off against BYU in DKR in about 3 weeks. And that could be a really exciting matchup. We know it's going to be an emotional matchup for Steve Sarkisian with BYU being his alma mater. But this is a BYU football team that plays really good football. And so Texas is going to have to come to play in that matchup as well. Oklahoma 50 over Iowa State 20. This game was 40-20 at halftime, and then Iowa State could not score in the second half, with Oklahoma adding 10 more points to get to the 30-point victory. This is an Oklahoma team that is now ranked number 12th in the country. I know Texas fans are saying we don't know if they're for real or not. They haven't played anybody. Their schedule has been pretty cupcake thus far. But the same thing I said about Texas applies to Oklahoma. You have to play who's in front of you. You have to play who suits up. And Oklahoma has gone out there and pretty much dominated every team they've played. I think their smallest margin of victory, maybe the 17 points against SMU, if I'm not mistaken. So Oklahoma has done really well. Texas has done really well. And now they have to clash in week 6, right? And one of those teams is going to walk out there with a loss, and another team is going to walk out of there undefeated, looking like the class of the Big 12. So this is one of the biggest games of the college football season. It usually is. This year it has a little more juice to it. Houston 28, Texas Tech 49. This game was 28-35 at halftime. Looked like a really good shootout between these two teams. Obviously, Donovan Smith left Texas Tech last year and went to the University of Houston starting. So that was that added storyline. But then Texas Tech just kind of took off in the second half. Houston, like Iowa State, didn't score in the second half. And then Texas Tech added 14 more points. A huge bounce-back victory for them after losing their starting quarterback last week to a gruesome injury. So, I know that there's this inherent rivalry now because of Brett Yormark and Joey McGuire and the comments he's made and all of that. But, I'm all about safety and these players making a living and these players going out there and doing what they love to do. And, after seeing that injury last night to their starting quarterback for Texas Tech, last week, to their starting quarterback for Texas Tech, I was somewhat rooting for them, to bounce back, rally around him and get a victory this week. And they certainly did that at home. Baylor 36, UCF 35. So if you listen to the podcast, some of you know my little sister is a sophomore at Baylor. I attended Texas Southern University. So our homecoming was on Saturday, and I just get a text from my sister who is at Baylor right now saying Baylor's back in all caps, right? And I'm like, what happened? I'm just dying laughing. And then I ask her, and she's like, oh, we had the largest comeback in program history. I'm like, what? And then I go look, and yes, UCF was up 35-10 going into the fourth quarter. And then Baylor scored 26 unanswered points to win that game. So a huge win for Dave Aranda after things have not looked great this year so far. That team showed huge resilience. Like I said, after everything that's happened to them, after getting blown out the previous week by Texas at home and not showing a pulse, to be down 35-10 in the fourth quarter, that team easily could have quit. That team easily could have mailed it in. They easily could have quit on Dave Aranda, who's probably fighting for his job at this point. But they showed that they're still playing hard. They showed that they still want to win, and they want to win for Dave Aranda by scoring 26 unanswered points in the fourth quarter to win a huge game. And for UCF, you have to ask what happened, right? How do you blow a 35-10 lead in the fourth quarter? That's kind of crazy. Huge win for Baylor, not so much for UCF. And then we look at West Virginia 24, TCU 21. I had a lot of confidence about TCU coming into the season. I said that we shouldn't take too much from the loss to Colorado from TCU because Colorado was probably better than we thought. And even with all of the mistakes TCU made, they lost by 3 and scored 42 points. But I can't excuse losing to West Virginia, right? 24-21 at home. I can't excuse that. And this is probably where you start to say, okay, all of those players they lost last year, Steve Avila, Quentin Johnston, Max Dugan, et cetera, Kendre Miller, are really starting to have an effect on this football team, right? Because there's no way, I don't even want to say it, but there's no way that TCU should be losing to West Virginia at home, right? That's just a really bad loss, and it shows that this is obviously not the same team that it was last year. And, now I would say that TCU is looking like a 4, maybe 5 loss team at this point with Texas on their schedule. West Virginia, 4-1. I said that if West Virginia could beat TCU, they could find themselves ranked. They are not. I think that's a mistake. LSU, I know they've had a tough schedule. I know LSU lost to Ole Miss and Florida State, which are two really good teams, two ranked teams. But it's too early in the season to have a two-loss team ranked, right? We've only played 5 games. So if you're 3-2, to me, that's just not a good enough excuse to be ranked. Even if the teams you played are really good, you're 3-2, right? It's okay to be outside of the top 25. I would have liked to see West Virginia in there. Maybe I still got a little Big 12 in my heart. I root for West Virginia a little bit. Neil Brown's on the hot seat, and this team has responded really well, going 4-1, 3 straight Power 5 victories. So I think that West Virginia, kind of got squeezed a little bit, not being ranked. Like I said, I think it's way too early in the season for a 2-loss team to be ranked, even if they've had the schedule that LSU has had. And now West Virginia will get one more chance to prove it, whoever they play next. So a really good win for them, a really good win for Neil Brown, who probably has the hottest seat in the country. That seat has cooled down a little bit. And, TCU and Sonny Dykes may be looking funny in the light. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Locked On Longhorns, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We will continue the conversation about, is Texas the best team in the country right now, even though the rankings don't reflect that. And then, of course, all week we'll have coverage leading up to the biggest game of the season, maybe in college football this far, the Red River Shootout between the Texas Longhorns and the Oklahoma Sooners. Hook 'em and peace.